Irirangi Poho, Radio Bosom.
The Wire.
Yes, welcome back to The Wire on 95BFM, and I am very pleased to be bringing you the return of the Southern Cross as a new regular Monday feature with Alistar Kata. She is the contributing editor to AUT's Pacific Media Centre's Pacific Media Watch project, and we will have her on the show every Monday to talk about what's going on in the Pacific. She's in the studio now. Also in the studio with us is David Robie, the director of the Pacific Media Centre and a veteran Pacific journalist turned journalism educator. Good afternoon, both of you.
Good afternoon, kia ora.
So, to mark the return of the Southern Cross, I thought it would be a great opportunity to talk about the state of Pacific media today. David, you recently wrote a book all about journalism in the Pacific. How would you rate the coverage of Pacific issues in the New Zealand media?
Well, frankly, pretty abysmal. It's appallingly bad. New Zealand media, by and large, I think has deteriorated actually in the last 2 decades. There was a time when most of the mainstream media actually gave a lot of attention to the Pacific region, and most of the main newspapers, then the Dominion, the New Zealand Herald, and so on, all had specialist Pacific affairs reporters. But now it's sort of like it's marginalised, and the only real issues that are picked up are disasters, and of course Fiji in the case of coups, but very little reporting about what's going on between or providing context or background.
So why is that, do you think? Is it just a case of the media being squeezed like it is in so many other issues? It doesn't have the money to cover Pacific issues properly?
Well, that's the excuse. We don't have the money, but it's about, maximising profits for the shareholders for most media organisations. But why is it that in other media in the region, for example, take Australia, the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, actually have foreign correspondents. They have correspondents reporting extensively in the region. We've got ABC, extensive coverage of the whole region. And apart from Radio New Zealand International, which does a really good job, the rest of the media not really all that interested in the Pacific.
Well, I mean, what's your take on it, Alistar? And you're studying at the moment, and obviously you have an interest in Pacific media. Are you worried that when you get out the other side, are you going to be able to work in this field?
Well, this is the thing. I mean, I'm so glad that I've got opportunities to work for places like the Pacific Media Centre and under Pacific Media Watch, because in my opinion, I totally agree with David. There is such a lack of Pacific issues in our mainstream media. And as you said before, it's a total excuse that there's no resources or money to cover these issues in the wider Pacific region. For example, One News has Jack Tame over in the States covering the broader issues that are happening there. Why can't we have someone in the Pacific? And there's so many things that go on in the Pacific region all the time, and there's not enough coverage. And our media, especially our mainstream media, really needs to take responsibility. It's such a worry for us Pacific students, especially in the journalism department, that there aren't enough outlets for us to get involved in that really take Pacific issues on board.
You talked, David, about sort of the only coverage the Pacific really gets is disasters and the odd coup. Obviously, the last Pacific story to really get big coverage would be Tropical Cyclone Pam in Vanuatu and elsewhere, but the coverage mainly focused on Vanuatu. How would you rate the coverage of that in particular?
I think it's very mixed. There was some good coverage, but by and large it was very parochial in its approach and very focused on New Zealand, the impact on New Zealanders living in Vanuatu and so on. And when you consider that the local media was, put in a very difficult situation without power and so on, and you get the local daily newspaper, for example, the Vanuatu Daily Post wasn't able to publish for 4 days. The resources that local media had was very limited, but actually it wasn't until that sort of media came on tap again that we got some really good coverage.
Yeah, I read an opinion piece by Gordon Campbell who suggested that he called the coverage disaster porn. Do you think that that's a fair characterisation?
Oh, definitely. I think, and that was actually a term that I was very happy to sort of repeat in some of our coverage. I would like to say that, one of the things that we've done at AET, in response to what Alistar was saying before, is that we created Pacific Scoop, which is a partnership with Scoop Media in Wellington, but we do the Pacific Scoop segment completely ourselves, and it's focused on the stories that aren't really being told, or looking at the gaps that are being left by the mainstream media.
Going back, if I can, to the term disaster porn, I think that sums it up pretty well. I mean, the thing about getting these extensive reports about the deaths and the disaster and destruction is that people focus on that too much. And yes, it's very important that we give aid to these places, but they need to look at the issues behind what is happening. Things like climate change, educating people on what they need to be doing to prepare for these disasters. So that's one of the things that's missing, and one of the things that we try to focus on at places like Pacific Media Centre.
Yeah, so essentially there's a lack of depth to the reporting.
Absolutely,
right.
Extensive reporting, yeah.
Sure. I want to move on to talking about the challenges faced by media working within the Pacific, and particularly issues of media freedom. You wrote in your book, David, your recent book, that West Papua is the most critical front line for defending media freedom in the South Pacific at present. What did you mean by that?
Well, because the threats to journalists in West Papua are the worst at the moment. We did a media freedom report to the Pacific Media Watch Project in 2011. And what came through very, very strongly in that report was the deaths and the risks to journalists in West Papua. But this is hidden, you see, because West Papua, being two Melanesian provinces in the western part of Papua New Guinea, or the New Guinea island, all those statistics are buried inside the Indonesian statistics. And so global media freedom organisations look at Indonesia as a whole, but they don't actually look at the West Papua, the Pacific aspect. So the actual realities get lost. And this is the biggest threat to the region, both in terms of media freedom and also security for the region. And over the last few years, until the elections last year in September in Fiji, there was an obsession of New Zealand media focusing on Fiji and the threat to media. In fact, actually the threat was fairly minor compared with West Papua, where journalists are killed, and a lot of other Papuans as well. So there needs to be a lot more coverage about West Papua in the New Zealand media.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned Fiji, though, because I believe you, Alistar, were in Fiji covering the election. What was your experience there? How free were you to cover that?
I mean, it was actually quite good because myself and another student who went over were linked quite closely to the local media. So we were kind of classified under the local media umbrella, which is quite great because we had ample access to, sources and going to press conferences and things like that. But I have to say that there's such an attitude, not only in Fiji but in the other Pacific islands, that the international media are just, they just cannot talk to the international media. They have such an attitude towards them, and I think it's because there's this idea that some international or foreign correspondents come over and they kind of parachute journalism is quite big. They have this idea that foreign correspondents just come in, get what they need to, and go out without any kind of care or sympathy to what's happening in the island. So we were quite lucky that we were linked locally, so we had access to everything, but there was definitely a kind of bad attitude towards the foreign correspondents. Yeah.
And if I could just add something on Fiji as well, because just to give you an example of the sort of problem that we have with mainstream media, is that we had a very prominent journalist on the largest media print newspaper in the country who knew nothing about Fiji, had never been there before, and was assigned to cover the elections. And we'd had a seminar at AET about how the new electoral system post-coup was going to operate, run by a number of Fijians, including a Fijian lawyer. And this prominent journalist came along to that, to discover all that he knew about the Fiji electoral system. And so when he was parachuting a few days later into Fiji, and I think that's an indictment of our mainstream media.
Finally, I want to talk to you about you write in your book about in the epilogue you paint a pretty bleak picture of Pacific journalism. You say that it's underfunded, the journalists are poorly trained or untrained even, and that often the best ones tend to leave journalism for other media-related careers. Bribery is commonplace, as is intimidation. You mentioned West Papua, journalists are even being killed. How does that get turned around? How does the Pacific develop strong, independent journalistic institutions?
Well, there's a lot of aid pouring into journalism education and training in the region. But sometimes it's misdirected. Sometimes it's too focused on particular agendas of donor organisations and so on, rather than what's actually needed. My own opinion is the main journalism schools, the 3 universities, are the ones that should really be supported, but they're not. There's been a focus on short course training in the region, and it means that if you actually leave high school and become a journalist on, say, one of the daily newspapers, maybe the Fiji Times or whatever in Fiji, you may not have had any real training at all. Then you're lucky if you get maybe a couple of weeks here and a couple of weeks there. When you compare that, say, with a country like New Zealand, where basically everybody goes into journalism these days, had a really solid foundation, a really good training and qualifications to start off. And what happens with the universities is the education is such that people have got a lot of opportunities, and so they end up in the media industry for maybe 6 months or so. Then they end up working for UN agencies, UNDP or whatever, because they've got a lot more career prospects and so on. So the cycle just keeps on turning on. I would say that probably in my 20 years experience in the Pacific, in journalism education, nothing has fundamentally changed, and yet millions of dollars have been spent on training.
Okay, well, David Robie, thank you very much for joining us today. Alistar Kata, we will be hearing from you in upcoming weeks. I should just say David's book is called Don't Spoil My Beautiful Face, Media, Mayhem and Human Rights in the Pacific. There you go, as a plug for you, David.